It is a bad sign, isn't it, that Beijing, through the Hong Kong police, have said because of coronavirus you can't commemorate the Tiananmen Square massacre this year?
Yes, it could be. It could be a bad sign, but I think overall we're all concerned about what's happening in Hong Kong, particularly the new security laws that are apparently going to be enacted by the so-called parliament, the rubber stamp parliament in Beijing, as they become more and more intolerant of dissent, including in Hong Kong. So, Hong Kong has been such a huge success story and such a tribute to an open and free society. And I had been optimistic in 1997 when I attended the handover representing Australia, that Hong Kong would continue to thrive, which largely it has done. But I think the omens are much worse now as the government in Beijing becomes increasingly aggressive, increasingly authoritarian, and one could almost say increasingly Maoist in its disposition.
I suppose we shouldn't be surprised when you look back to 1989 and what happened in Tiananmen Square. I mean, there was a fair bit of a global scrutiny there, a fair bit of transparency. It wasn't complete by any stretch, but the rest of the world got to find out what was going on, yet China still went in there with troops and got rid of those protesters. So it demonstrated then that it just would not broker dissent.
No, but but there are two things to say about that. One is back then in 1989, remember this was just at the end of the so-called Cold War, when the Berlin Wall was coming down and the Soviet Union very soon after that collapsed, and we thought we had entered an era when liberal democracy had finally triumphed. And I think what we're reminded of by that event of all those years ago in Tiananmen Square, but what we're also by recent events, is that the triumph of liberal democracy shouldn't be given. And China, I suppose it's the second point I was going to make, China is educated, as all countries are, by its history. This is a country that had the scarring experience of a civil war in the lifetimes of, well, less so now, but didn't finish until 1949. So in the lifetimes of some of its leaders. And they don't want to see it happen again. They live in fear of the country fracturing and falling apart, descending into chaos. It's a real mindset of the Chinese leadership, and that's one of the reasons why it's not just ideology, it's one of the reasons why they're so intolerant of dissent.
So the signs are ominous in Hong Kong. Many countries around the world have spoken up against what's going on. They're looking to preserve the autonomy, the special status of the former colony of Hong Kong. Australia has joined some of those statements. America, through Donald Trump, has imposed some economic sanctions, if you like, removing or threatening to remove some economic privileges for Hong Kong. Is that likely to sway Beijing in any way, shape or form?
No, nothing will sway them now. China is rich enough to put up with the blandishments that might come from Western countries, including the United States, and particularly any measures they might take. China will simply resist that. So I think it's a very sad thing. The Australian government did the right thing to join with the UK and the US and Canada and New Zealand in expressing their concern about what was happening in Hong Kong. But sadly, I don't think it's going to make a great deal of difference. Boris Johnson has been very forward-leaning in saying that he'll take the people who have British national overseas passports from Hong Kong into the UK, and there are over 2 million of these people. Wow. I don't suppose they'll all take up the offer, but it's symbolically a very important gesture from the British government. But none of these things are going to sway China. I mean, the regime of Xi Jinping is a much tougher regime than we've seen in China at any time since Deng Xiaoping came to power and replaced basically the Maoist era. But we're really back into a very tough regime now, and I think it'll be very hard to persuade them.
Given Australia's history and Australia's values, should we be offering any sort of special priority for potential immigrants from Hong Kong as well?
Well, we might be able to do something. We should be talking to the British government about that. One of the possibilities is that we would allow people the opportunity to come here, perhaps for a limited period. You might recall many years ago when, what would it have been, 1999, there was a civil war in Kosovo, and we took quite a number of, I don't remember how many now, of Albanian Kosovars to Australia, and we brought them here on a temporary basis. So when the war was over, we allowed them to go back to Kosovo. We could take people from Hong Kong on a temporary basis. Obviously, it would be pretty difficult to take hundreds of thousands of them, but we should in any case look upon them sympathetically. There are a lot of Australians, in any case, a lot of Australian passport holders who live in Hong Kong. It's a very close relationship, historically, the relationship between Australia and Hong Kong. So we should do what we can to look after them in our very limited way.
Alexander, thanks for joining us again.
It's a pleasure, Chris.